thanks. So lovely, lovely passage. So put it into context for us a little bit more, as you allude to there, the kind of the environment that Sorge was living in. You know, when one thinks about those other fellow travellers from the West, Phil B. McLean, for example, in the UK, and so on. I mean, how to situate him and his experiences to explain the motivation and put him in the context of the times.
Well, he's of course about half a generation older than Burgess and Phil B. McLean. He was recruited as a young communist hothead activist right at the beginning of the 1920s. He moves to Moscow as a Comintern official in 1924, and he really sort of grows, and he joins the Fourth Department, Soviet Military Intelligence, at the very end of the 20s. And of course, with hindsight, we might wonder why somebody might go from a bourgeois German background to serving a leader as ruthless and bloody as Stalin. But actually, when you try and put yourself in the world, say the world of late 1929, early 1930, when Sorge went off to his first foreign posting for the Fourth Department, he went to Shanghai, in fact, you could really see that an idealistic, intelligent person might very well believe that the Soviet Union was the future of humanity. Scientific socialism, bringing a medieval backward country that had been semi-destroyed by the First World War into the bright white heat of technology and prosperity for all. And you could also be forgiven for thinking that the Western world was completely rotten and completely decadent. You have the Wall Street crash in 1929, October 1929. You have the rise of the fascism in Italy and Germany. So if you actually take that particular period, it's actually very clear that Western idealists could actually see themselves joining this new world, becoming part of it. And Sorge, in fact, like many of his generation, began, of course, to become profoundly disillusioned as the Stalin purges start to roll. And one of the surprising things about the Sorge story, there are a huge number of examples of how the man had the devil's own luck, really, on many occasions. But one of them was that Sorge managed to avoid being shot in the purges, and he did it almost by accident, actually, because because there was a summons that went out from the Fourth Department at the beginning of 1938 to call all agents in the field into Moscow for consultations, quote unquote. Now, in fact, already the head of the Fourth Department, Jan Pedersen, had already been removed by this time. And furthermore, that he actually had a very clear, that there was actually a very clear intention or very clear presumption that everyone who was connected with abroad, everybody who was out in the field, was suspect. And Sorge survived, to cut a long story short, by agreeing to return, but actually not returning. He quoted, in fact, there was a good operational reason for him not to return immediately, because he was waiting for one of his key Japanese agents to come back from a trip in Manchuria. So there was like he had a solid operational excuse. So, and as it turns out, that was extremely fortunate, because nobody who returned to, none of his colleagues that returned to Moscow in that time, 1938, escaped being either shot or sent to the Gulag. And similarly, the few agents that defied Moscow, every single one of them, well, no, with one exception, were in turn hunted down and murdered by the NKVD in subsequent years, Mossad style. So Sorge was amazingly fortunate in escaping the purges.
So he certainly had a good instinct for self-preservation. Is there any evidence of remorse, perhaps, or kind of beginning to think that the great ideological dream that he had bought into, was no longer worth serving, as it were? It had gone sour.
Well, that brings us to the question of his motivation, and that's actually something that it makes him so fascinating, because one of the things about Sorge and what makes him such a colourful character and such a joy to write about is, although I describe him as an impeccable spy, because that's a quote from Kim Philby saying his work was impeccable, in fact, on an operational level, his work and certainly his personal life was very far from impeccable, because he was in fact a hard-drinking, womanizing man. And the battlefields of his personal espionage war that had been selected for him, partly by his bosses, but partly by himself, were the casinos and dance halls and brothels of Shanghai and then Tokyo. And his job was to pretend to be a high-living, decadent German journalist. And he found the role entirely to his liking. So he certainly didn't live like a sort of strict communist apparatchik. As for his sincerity, I think that I think it's clear that he was willing to put up with a life of extreme risk, and I think that he saw himself, a part of his self-image, an important, probably central part of his self-image, was as a soldier of the revolution. And when he was hanged, sorry, it's a bit of a spoiler there, but it is actually right at the beginning of the book. So I have to tell you that he is hanged on Revolution Day in 1944 in a Japanese prison in Sugamo in Tokyo. But as he goes, he stands on the scaffold with the rope around hangman's noose around his neck. He says, "Long live the revolution, long live the Japanese Communist Party, long live the Red Army," he says. So he clearly lived and died as a soldier of the revolution.